The 79 to 85 Buick Riviera was a highly successful variant of this nameplate for Buick, and Buick sold about 340,000 of these vehicles from the 1979 model year through the 1985 model year. And I have to say that the 79 to 85 Riviera is one of my favorite versions of this overall generation, especially the T-Type with no vinyl roof that we are going to take a look at here. When this car was first introduced in 1979, it marked a dramatic shift from the two-year-only 77 and 78 Riviera that preceded it. That Riviera was kind of a non-event and almost forgotten. It was basically a warmed-over LeSabre that really didn't have much visual pizzazz, and that's because that 77 and 78 Riviera was a reaction of Buick's general management to the boat-tail Riviera. They wanted something far more conventional than what they had to sell for the 1971 to 1973 model years. And so they got something that was very milquetoast and vanilla, and I would just say forgettable. But for 1979, the GM design team had convinced Buick general management that they needed to put some romance back into the Riviera, and they came out with a beautiful car that sold extremely well each year from 1979 through 1985. This was also a relatively revolutionary year for the Riviera because it would transition to becoming front-wheel drive in 1979 after it had been rear-wheel drive for its entire life. In fact, the Riviera was the lone e-car variant of the Oldsmobile Tornado, Buick Riviera, and Eldorado that would remain rear-wheel drive for the 1966 to 1970 model years. Now, this particular Riviera is a 1985 T-Type turbocharged Riviera, and they only made about 1,000 of these, and they're pretty special. There were T-Types all the way back to 1981. Through the 1981 model year, it was just called the Riviera Turbo. There was the Sport Coupe, etc. But then in 1981, the turbocharged versions were renamed T-Type, the T for turbo, although not all Buick T-Types had a turbocharged engine like the Century T-Type. But, well, that's another story for a different day. In any case, this particular 85 Riviera T-Type, I think, is a stunning automobile, really because it doesn't have a vinyl roof. And unfortunately, so many of these Rivieras had that vinyl roof, but it really hides a lot of the beauty in the design here that we're going to see. First, let's take a look at some of the side view, which, of course, you'd have on a standard Riviera, even with a vinyl top. But I love the actual wheels here, these turbine vane wheels that are just stunning and menacing at the same time. They're not overly large, but they are beautiful. And you can also see a number of elements of beauty here. Those beautiful toothpick A-pillars with the kink in the middle. And then you have this undulating belt line that kind of rises and falls and rises and falls. You also have a bone line that's beneath that belt line that runs the length of the entire vehicle. You can see it's accentuated by a pinstripe on this particular car. It's too bad this car does have that body side molding. I wish that were removed, but oh well, what can you do? And here you have the beautiful rear three-quarter view of this 85 Riviera T-Type, and you can see a number of details that I think are just especially beautiful on this car. That bone line, again, that I was mentioning that runs the length of the car, that kind of goes up and down and up and down. Very graceful, flowing line, very Buick-like. Then you have the C-pillar that's kind of in contrast to that, this razor's edge sharp crease. You can see that there's the crease in the roof that goes all the way back to the very edge of the C-pillar. And you have kind of a crease that frames the backlight with a very vertical, formal style backlight. And a detail that you don't see in some views, but I love, notice the C-pillar, the bottom portion of the C-pillar as it goes rearward toward the deck lid actually starts coming inward. And it creates this little surface, like a little shoulder there. And I think that's just a beautiful detail as opposed to having this roof just come down straight. It kind of pulls in as it goes rearward. Now, the rear three-quarter view of this, unfortunately, one of the things that you can see is the bumper fillers, which on this car actually appear to be in good shape, but it's too bad. So many of these cars, the bumper fillers, especially by this point, are just cracking and they look terrible. And you have the reverse lights that are the Riviera logo inset into the tail lights. I always thought that was a cool detail. One thing I do wish was a little bit different. You know, the roof has such a sharp crease to it, and it's very tight. That deck lid crease in the middle there, that feature line, I wish it were a bit sharper than what it is. It just doesn't quite fit the car from at least my taste, but hey, what do I know? I'm not a designer. I'm just a bean counter. And I wanted to show this little close-up of that C-pillar area. Notice the C-pillar is huge. It's extremely large. It gives you that sense of privacy if you're sitting in the back seat, but you can also see this little shoulder that I'm talking about a bit better that just develops as that C-pillar moves rearward. And unfortunately, on the vinyl top cars, you're not able to see that detail. There's also a little fillet at the bottom of the C-pillar. It's hard to see, but it doesn't come straight down. It kind of has this little fillet at the bottom, a beautiful fine detail on these 85 Rivieras, or I should say the 79 to 85 Rivieras, again, that you just don't see with the vinyl top. Now, as we transition to the inside of this Riviera, we have expanses of fake wood grain all over the dash. Look at that glove box door with the fake burl walnut. Then, of course, you have the speaker grills and the door panels just ahead of the door handle that are also faux wood grain. So, yeah, this was the 80s. It was a time of fake wood grain. And some of that was for cost, but also because they thought that this was more durable than real wood at the time. Now, you do have this very large vertically oriented dash on these. It's visually tall. And you have kind of a large hood over the instrument cluster. Not as large of a hood as what you would see on the Cadillacs, but you do have one nonetheless here. This car is equipped with the bench seating. This is a split bench seat. I don't know if that's necessarily becoming of the T-Type, but at least you do get the extra sporty three-spoke steering wheel there with the metal spokes, and it is leather wrapped. Here you have a close-up of the center section of the dash. At this point, GM was using kind of the same radios in all of its vehicles. The Cadillacs did get a little bit different faceplate, but by and large, they were all the same radios. There were different variants of it. This one has the 5-band graphic equalizer and cassette tape player with auto reverse, which means that it will flip the cassette tape to the other side. You could also search. There's a search feature for the next song on your cassette tape, which was kind of handy. These radios actually sounded great in these 80s era GM vehicles. You can see this one says concert sound. And again, they were good sounding radios, better than a lot of modern radios. Even though they didn't have a huge amount of wattage, but they did have a great just tonal quality to them. And you can see this is the early days of ergonomics. I would say even a little bit before ergonomics. Remember, this dashboard was designed in the late 1970s, and look where that rear defogger switch is. Imagine if you're in the driver's seat, what kind of a reach you'd have to reach all the way over there to switch the rear defogger on. I don't know why they located the switch there, but it certainly wasn't overly convenient. And then you have the climate control panel, which I always thought was interesting because you could turn the heat or the air conditioning up in 1 degree increments, but it just was like a little bar graph. This little dot would move over as opposed to having an actual digital readout, which Cadillac, for instance, would have. So just a little bit different approach to the automatic climate control in these than some of the other divisions had. And we'll kind of close out here with one last interior shot in this bench seat. Notice there's not all that much rear seat room in these Rivieras. They did have about the same as the previous generation, the 77 to 78s. But the Riviera and these kind of close couple coupes never had all that much rear seat space. I guess they were just thinking that, this was a personal luxury car and you had people back there only in the event that, you were kind of in an emergency and you had a few seats for them. But not a place that I'd want to be on a long trip, for instance. Okay, and now we get to the cool part of this Riviera and the very rare part, the turbocharged 3.8-liter V6 engine under hood. Again, by this point, the Buick division was selling about 1,000, 1,100 of these turbocharged Rivieras, so they were very, very rare. And they have a lot of early electronics on these, which is good and bad because it means it's hard to find replacement parts in the event you need them. Kind of a standard multi-port injection setup. You can see the fuel rail there in the middle of the engine. The turbocharger is also in the center line of the intake. Now, this is an early application of a couple technologies, at least for General Motors. The first is the computer-controlled distributorless ignition, which you see there on the driver's side at the front. It says computer-controlled coil ignition. This would make it through on the 1986 versions of the C cars. If you recall, the 1985 C cars, the Olds 98 Buick Electra, had a distributor in place of this kind of an ignition control module in that model year and that model year alone. So I don't know if GM had some issues with this, and then they went back to the distributor for 1985 in those C cars, but this does have the distributor-less ignition setup. It also has an early application of a mass airflow sensor, which you can see in the intake airstream there. GM would have a number of challenges with that mass airflow sensor setup in the early years that it was developed. They would finally get it right for the 1987 model year when they would put a honeycomb flow straightener in front of the mass airflow sensor. And they'd also have a Venturi effect in that particular model year on the mass airflow sensor as the midsection narrowed relative to the ends. That was a design change that was affected, as I said, for the 1987 model year on those. But again, you've got a lot of early electronics on this vehicle, and while I'd love to have one of these, again, trying to troubleshoot and diagnose and find parts has got to be challenging. You notice the fuel rail says sequential fuel injection, so this actually, I said multi-port before. This isn't multi-port. Multi-port would be a batch fire setup where all the injectors are firing at once. Sequential means that they're firing, each injector is firing individually along with the firing order of the individual cylinders. So this is more advanced and better for fuel atomization. But you can see the little EGR is on the driver's side of the engine there near the oil fill cap, and it's got a little plastic beauty cover, black plastic beauty cover over it. I don't know why they did that. You have the EGR solenoid next to it, got the fuel pressure regulator ahead of it right next to the computer-controlled ignition box. And of course, back at the turbocharger, you've got all the other electronics for that, including the wastegate. So this is just an overly complicated 80s era engine, and it did make 200 horsepower at a time when almost nothing made 200 horsepower back then unless you got a Corvette. So this was a high horsepower engine and 300 pound-feet of torque. Now, unfortunately, the turbohydromatic 325 transmission was not nearly as durable as the previous generation Rivieras and their turbohydromatic 400 transmissions. And so I think these had some challenges with transmission durability, especially because people would kind of hold the brake and brake torque these so the turbo would spool up and then launch them. Of course, you get a faster launch because the turbo's already spooled up, and then you could shred your tires, the front wheels obviously in this case, as you took off. But you can imagine how hard that would be on the transmission and the CV joints. And my guess is that that was kind of how people operated these. I mean, you bought the T-Type to drive it relatively hard, right? So you don't want to just kind of have light throttle tip in. Now, having driven one of these before, I will say that they are discernibly turbocharged. And what do I mean by that? Well, a lot of modern vehicles, when you drive them, the turbochargers are so small, or they have two turbochargers on them, twin turbocharged, and each of those units is smaller, so it spools up quicker or more quickly. On this one, you see how big the turbocharger is, and that means that there's some significant turbo lag. You first step on the accelerator, and it feels pretty boggy, and then all of a sudden, you hear the whoosh, and then you're kind of off. And that was one of the charm points, let's say, of these Rivieras, was that relatively significant turbo lag, and another reason why people like to brake torque them so they could break away from a stoplight pretty fast. And there we have this 1985 Buick Riviera T-Type. I do love the turbocharged license plate there. That emblem was also used on the Grand National and other T-Types. I think it was designed by a gentleman by the name of Steve Pastiner, who did that logo. Kind of a cool look overall. This car also has the lamp monitors. You can see those little bumps that are on top of the headlamps that would tell you if your lamps were working. So a handy little feature there. Put a comment in the comment section. What do you think of this awesome 1985 Riviera T-Type? Thanks again for watching.